I'm able to kind of take what I have been through and channel it to help other people, I think, more easily, because I think you don't have to go through the exact same thing in order to help someone. But I think in some circumstances, when you have gone through it, like when you've gone through losing a parent, or when you've been in an abusive relationship, or you are navigating anything complicated and like trying to start a family aspect, I feel like it really does help other people feel heard and validated when you have gone through some version of that, even though it's not the same thing. So I think God has used all of that to help bless other people when I can in my counseling career. And I feel like it's just the classic, like sometimes you have to hit rock bottom in order to really build yourself back up.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to another YouTube video for P40 Ministries. And today I have a wonderful guest on this episode who is going to share her testimony with us. And this is Rachel Bonilla. She has been a friend of mine for probably 7 or 8 years now, which is really crazy. But Rachel, I'm going to have you start actually. I'm going to put all the pressure on you and take it off of me. So why don't you start by introducing yourself to the audience and just share like a hobby that you enjoy, and then we'll get into your testimony.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Bonilla. I am married. I just had a baby boy a little over 2 months ago. I'm a licensed independent social worker. So I work as a counselor. And as far as hobbies go, I love to read. That's the number one thing that comes to mind. I do like going for walks, like outdoor walking is one of my favorite things. And I also like yoga, although I don't make nearly as much time for that as I probably should. But those are a few hobbies I like.
I don't make time for exercise, like ever. It's hard.
Really outdoor walking is like the best thing because it just feels easier than going to a gym and that whole aspect. So
Yeah, especially now that you have a newborn. I can imagine that's pretty tough to like find any time for yourself to do anything.
that's correct.
How have you been adjusting to that? Has it been an interesting adjustment?
It has. It changes like day to day, week to week. There are more good days now. There's a lot of like weird pressure I feel like that happens when you have a baby, especially when it's your first. There's just this pressure, I think, for moms where you have to like cut out all the bad stuff, and you're supposed to be the happiest you've ever been. And the reality is it's really, really, really hard, especially again, when it's your first and you have no idea what you're doing. Thank God I have amazing support. And, my mom lives very, very close to us and my husband's wonderful. But even with all that, it's still incredibly hard. So I have a whole new respect for any parent out there who doesn't have a lot of support, or single parents or anything like that. So
Yeah, I can
hard,
imagine.
but also really cool.
Yeah. All right, let's get into your story because you've got a really interesting story. And it starts out when I don't remember how old you were, but it starts out when you were relatively young. So why don't you share with the audience a little bit about growing up and what happened with your family?
So I was born into a Christian home. Was very blessed to have the family that I do. It's just me and my brother, and then my parents. Relatively, normal upbringing for a Christian family. When I was 13, my dad suddenly passed away. He passed away in his sleep. I never remember the technical medical term for it, but his heart basically just stopped in the middle of the night. And there were no signs leading up to it other than he had high blood pressure here and there, but he was a healthy guy. So it was very, very sudden. I was 13. My brother was 8, I believe. And that was definitely the first and hardest thing that I had to go through as a kid. And it was just a weird, being 13 is already a really weird age where you're, figuring out puberty and I was in junior high, just a lot of things going on already. And then incorporating that into it was challenging. So yeah, that kind of was the first one of the shaping points in my life. Kind of where you have that like I was this person before this and now I'm this person after. Like that's kind of what trauma is defined by. If you feel like you have a before and an after the event that happened, that's kind of how I utilize that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is an off the cuff question, but as a social worker, and you do a lot of like counseling, kind of, right? In your
Hmm.
job, how
Yes.
have you seen, how have you moved into that position because of your past trauma? Did your past trauma define your current career?
I so yes, it definitely had an influence on it. Um I still feel like there's a good chance of me moving into the role that I have even if that hadn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um just because when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I originally was going to try and be a teacher. I majored in early childhood education at college, and I by the end of my freshman year hated it. I didn't like the classes. I just knew it wasn't for me. So then I switched into social work, and so it wasn't like an immediate decision, but it was a combination of, my brother and I had gone through grief counseling. It was like a group for kids.
Mm-hmm.
And we did like art therapy and stuff. And at the time, I remember being annoyed with it. Like I didn't want to go. But as I got older, I could see that it was helpful for me at the time. So that always stuck with me. And then I always felt like I was kind of like the listener in my group of friends. I recognized I was someone that they would come to for advice or just some insight. And I liked it. I like listening. I love hearing people's stories. I like feeling like I helped someone, even if it's just by listening and not really giving any type of advice. So I think it was a combination of the two.
Oh, for sure. And I would say, even now, you're still the listener, even between you and I. Like when we go out to dinner, I feel like you're always listening. And then I feel super selfish when we leave because I'm like,
No,
man, I did all the talking. I didn't ask her anything.
no, I love it. I like listening.
Yeah. So, regarding your mom, how did you see this affect her?
I guess that was another indicator of I ending up doing what I'm doing now. She had a really hard time with it, obviously. It was her husband, and they were very close. She ended up having to go seek some outside help for a while, and was just really questioning her purpose in life at that point. Her and I have had some really good conversations since, as I got older, of like just kind of looking back at that time. She was clearly drowning in grief,
Mm.
but it was a really good example of how Satan kind of strikes when you're most vulnerable, and was trying to convince her that my brother and I would be better off with, other family members or friends, and that she basically had no purpose here anymore. And she really believed that because she was devastated. So she, I recognized she was not healthy. And I kind of put my own stuff on pause because I went through a phase where I was really worried about her after my dad passed. Just the mindset of like, I'm already down one parent. Like anytime she wasn't home at the time she was supposed to be, I was worried about her. I was worried about her driving. So, I was recognizing that she wasn't healthy, and had seen some signs that she could possibly do something to herself. So she was
Mm.
willing to get help, thank God. And she got it and, started her own grieving recovery process after that. But that was also something that kind of shaped where my place is in the helping field as well.
Right. So you kind of alluded to this a little bit. Were you unable to grieve, do you think, during that time? Just because of just because of your, trying to take care of your mom, do you think you didn't properly go through the grieving process?
I think about that a lot. Um, and I don't think I grieved to the extent I should have. And I'm sure, again, it's a combination of things. I think seeing how much my mom was affected definitely impacted me, and just making sure, like, I had to make sure she was, going to be okay. And then by the time she was okay, I think the other part was just my age. I was a teenager. I was involved in sports. I had a really good group of friends that I was with all the time. I had a boyfriend, my junior year. Like, I was distracted. I was distracted by things high school kids are distracted by. And um, so I think it was a combination of both those things. And it didn't really catch up to me until like post college, when life slows down and the social aspect slows down a little bit.
So what did you find yourself doing besides, the boyfriend? I know that you were really involved in volleyball, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Volleyball. I played softball. So that was a fall sport and a spring sport. So winter was the only time I wasn't doing anything. And then for fall sports, you pretty much start preparing in July. So half my summer was, it took up a lot of my time. And like I said, I was always with friends. I was probably with friends more. Like, I was out of the house more because my dad died. I think I didn't realize that at the time, but my mom was, starting to work different jobs since my dad had passed. And then, my brother was younger and he had his own stuff and he was involved in soccer. And so that might have been a distraction that I wasn't consciously aware of too. I just didn't really, not that I didn't want to be at home, but again, what I had been through combined with the age, that's a pretty egocentric age, like the teenage years. And I just wanted to be with my friends. So I was
Mm-hmm.
busy, and
Right.
it might have been more on purpose than I realized at the time.
Yeah. So meanwhile, as you're in high school and moving into that phase of your life, how do you see your family coping with this?
We're talking like at the time, not now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like at the time, as you're in high school, how did you see your family coping?
I think this is something that makes grief really tricky for everyone. If it's like a family death, everyone grieves so differently. And there's so many factors with that, whether it's gender, age, just where each person is at, their relationship with the person that has passed. So my brother, he was, again, that's a whole other, it, complicated for him too, but a different complicated for me, because he was only 8 at the time. So for him, I think it was more anger because he got even less time with him. I know for both of us, it was triggering sometimes to just be around families that were like full, like mom, dad, siblings. Um, I know I had a really hard time with that sometimes, and just a lot of jealousy and anger. And he did too, just in a different way and a little bit later. Like, his didn't happen right away. I think he just was sad for a while and probably really confused. And then as
Mm-hmm.
he grew into his teenage years, that's where all the angst and everything happened. Um, and then both of us did not react super well to Alan, which is not our proudest moment. Um, but it is what it is. We did not welcome him with open arms, who is now my mom's now husband, who is a wonderful person. Um, and then my mom, I think she also busied herself. I just remember her being sad. I remember her crying a lot. I know she worked really hard to keep it together, to make sure my brother and we were always taken care of. Um, and we all, I think, just leaned on our friends a lot during that time. Our biological family is very, very small. It always has been. So God has always kind of looked out for us. And at every chapter of life, I feel like we've always had family friends that have really come through. So she leaned on those a lot. And then she eventually got to a place where, she wanted to be married again. She didn't want to be alone. She still had so much of her life left and started praying about that. And then her and Alan got married 2011. So I was just finished my freshman year of college when they got married.
Hmm. Yeah. When I first met you, I'll be honest, I thought Alan was your dad for like several years. It wasn't until we went out to coffee that one time, like years ago. I think I might have known you for like 3 years by that point, though. When you were like, Alan's not my dad. And I'm like, he's not?
I think a lot of people in the church did because it's super sweet. I got annoyed with it at the time, but
Yeah.
he introduced Luke and I like, this is my daughter. Like he didn't do the whole step thing.
Mm,
And I was the one that was like, he's my stepdad. Like I wanted to make it known, like, I just wasn't ready for that.
mm.
But he, like I said, I can't say enough good things about him now. And he put up with a lot between my brother and I. My brother is more of the like outwardly anger person. And because he was younger, Alan had to do more like actual parenting with him. I was already kind of, done, and he knew that. And he just, he did kind of tiptoe around me. But Luke had to be, still disciplined sometimes, especially because he, would have moments that were pretty disrespectful to him. And then I just was petty and did like the silent treatment and was super moody and all of that. So, um, yeah, he put up with a lot in the beginning. My brother and I both cried, and not tears of joy, at their wedding. Like, I feel like I ruined all my mom's pictures. We're sobbing the entire ceremony, like walking her down the aisle. And yeah, but they've been together. I think this will be 12 years, 13.
So, what made your relationship with Alan change?
I think just time. Like I think I needed to, clearly, as evidenced by the way that I handled it, a good sign that I had not grieved the amount I should. Not that anyone is thrilled with seeing, their parent be with someone else after one parent dies. Like, I'm not saying it shouldn't have been hard, but the reaction I had, and had for a while, like it wasn't just like a year or so. It was a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think recognizing that I needed to grieve further, and I just needed to mature. I needed to grow in my own faith. I needed to stop being selfish and recognize like it's not about me. Yeah, it's hard for me to see my mom with a new man, but also I didn't want her to be by herself for, the 2/3 of her life. Like she's like the best person ever. I didn't want that for her. So maturing and working on my own stuff, I think.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking, like, while you were talking, it would be really interesting to have your mom even to interview her because she's got a whole different aspect of everything that went on. And how old was she when your dad died?
Next year it would be 20 years. So 41, 42,
Yeah, and
early 40s.
that's really young to lose a husband.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, you still have so much life left.
Mm.
I think I know, she hated the thought once she got to a place where she could, stomach dating again. She she likes, having a partnership. She doesn't she never wanted to be alone, but she did recognize that was one of the things we had talked about in the years since is, again, of course, she's going to be devastated that her husband died, but she has recognized that she felt like she had put, in the tiers of things in your life. If you're a Christian, it is supposed to be Christ, your spouse, your kids.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that she responded, especially with, the hospital and everything, she said she realized she does not feel that Christ was truly first. And sometimes you don't really realize that until something like that happens, which is awful. But sometimes it can be really easy to make our relationship or our marriage an idol without even recognizing it.
Mm-hmm. And that's what the sermon was about actually 2 weeks ago at church.
Mm,
Yeah, Ray Byrne
okay.
discussed that. He was talking about how a lot of times we put like our family on this pedestal above God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Very easy to do.
It is very easy to do, and I find myself even doing that sometimes with Garrett. Yeah. And then Garrett disappoints me and I'm like, psh.
I Yeah, when you take a step back, like it sounds so ridiculous. Like we just assume our spouses are not going to be flawed or
Yeah.
whatever. But clearly that's why no one is on the same tier as God, but we're human
Right.
beings.
But even so, I mean, marriage is good and God put it there for a reason. It was the first thing basically God ever instituted was marriage.
He knew how
And
important it was going to be.
it is. And so I can imagine your mom losing her husband at such a young age was just absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So after high school, you lost your dad, you're feeling that void in your family. What happens after high school with you?
So after high school, I went to college in Pennsylvania. And college was similar to high school in that, like, when I think back, I was very, very distracted. I again made, great friends that I still am friends with to this day. Um, I enjoyed myself, but probably enjoyed myself a little too much. That was, in terms of my faith, that was definitely where I started to just kind of be much more of the world than in the world.
Mm.
I never really I went to church on campus in a total of 4 years. I maybe went 5 times. Um, it wasn't my priority. I had been broken up with from my high school relationship, um, which anyone that has been in a serious high school relationship, even though it sounds so crazy when your brain has fully developed, but you really feel like you're going to marry that person. And I definitely felt that way and just didn't handle it well at all. So that kind of, I was like drinking more than I should have. I was drinking more. I shouldn't have been drinking at all because I wasn't 21 yet. But yeah, just kind of got caught up in all the stuff that the average secular college kid gets into. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what the next 4 years look like. Like I said, I majored in social work, graduated with my bachelor's. Post graduation, so to complete the bachelor degree for social work, you had to do an internship. So I served my internship the summer after my senior year, and I served it at a residential facility in PA. And got my own apartment and everything, and it was a super hard job. Basically, I was like a house mom for teenagers that had behavioral and mental health problems. A lot that had come from homes of abuse or neglect or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it was a very, very hard job. I mean, anything in the social work field is hard, but this was like a very hands-on type of hard. Um, so I already, like, again, hindsight 2020, probably wasn't the smartest job for me to choose right off the bat. Um, with how young I was, and I was living in a town where I didn't have my family. I didn't have any friends from college in that town either. And this is kind of where the stuff from my dad catches up to me, because I was struggling. I feel that that's a hard time for people too, if they do go to college. And I guess even if they don't, like your early 20s, where you're an adult and you're kind of expected to start figuring stuff out, and you don't have much figured out then. Like, I was a completely different person at 22 than I am now at 31. So I struggled with not being in college anymore, and like this new normal and all of that. Um,
Right. And okay, I just have to say though, when I started my job at the Montessori school, I was terrified because of the story you told me
oh,
about your, because I was, for those of you who don't know, I was a house parent at a Montessori school for like 2 months.
yep.
And
Sorry about that.
no, I mean, in some ways you were absolutely right. In a way, you kind of warned me like what I was getting into, though the school was not for like kids with behavioral issues, but man, they had behavioral issues.
It it was so hard. Like I said, anything in that like field is tough, but teenagers are a different breed, and teenagers that have already basically been through hell by the time they're like 10
Yeah,
are an
for
even
sure.
different breed. And yeah, I would never, 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 no matter what salary I was offered, I would never go back to that job or anything in that realm ever again.
Right.
So
Yeah, I mean, even in my case, I agree with you. I would not go back to that position. For me, I've learned it takes a very strong personality, I think, to be able to do that kind of career. I definitely don't have that strong personality for sure.
yeah, I also do not. And that definitely was part of the problem, because I like watched myself change throughout that job. Um, I am not, as you can testify, I would not classify myself as like an angry person or an intense person, or like I said, I don't really have that type of strong personality. But after working there a while, you do, like, I mean, these kids are calling you every name in the book. You are restraining kids. Like, you have to develop hardness and tough skin, more than tough skin, because I don't want it to sound like I was proud of the way I was changing, because I wasn't. My temper was increasing. I just felt myself hardening.
Hmm.
So that wasn't super healthy. And then um, I started to be involved romantically with a coworker who technically was a supervisor at the time. We worked very closely together, because in the houses, there's a co-ed house and a boys house. The co-ed house was mostly girls. The boys, if there were boys there, they had to be like under the age of 10, and they were on a different floor and everything. But that's the house we worked at. And they tried really hard to always have a male and female together because of the physical aspect, like the restraints and stuff. So him and I were kind of the primary people Monday through Friday. So we worked together all the time in a very intense environment. And you really do have to, like, if he wasn't there, I was like freaking out, because he was like a bigger guy. Like, the kids responded to him, they were intimidated by him. So it made my life easier working with him.
And I can imagine even your age probably played a role in how the kids treated you because they probably saw you more on their level because you said you were only 22 at this time.
Right. I was
Yeah.
22, and sometimes we had like, oftentimes we had 16, 17, 18-year-old girls there. So yeah, I was barely older than them. They could tell I'm not like this seasoned adult. So
Mhm.
yeah, they would absolutely take advantage of that. And my coworker, the one I was involved in, was a decent amount older than me. So yeah, he just had more authority, and the dynamic was just so strange and unhealthy, and it turned romantic because I think a I was protected by him. Like, I felt protected, I felt safe around him in this time in my life where young, vulnerable, don't know what I'm doing, scared. And so I felt protected. And then I think that's where, like, I know this is a term that is probably a little controversial, but like that's where like the daddy issues kind of came into play. Because you know, I I missed that. Like, my dad died right as I turned, like a month after I turned 13. So
Well, yeah, he was like a father figure in a way.
hmm
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So
Mhm.
I never got to feel that like protection growing up from the male role model that you expect to, scaring boyfriends, or just knowing that they would do anything for you. Not that my mom wouldn't, but it's a different type of relationship you have with your dad than your mom
Yeah.
as a daughter, as a woman. So
Exactly.
um
And then plus by the time Alan came into your life, you were already older at that point.
yeah, yeah, I was 19, and I really didn't want much to do with him for the
Right.
first few years. So yeah, I didn't really have that.
Can I ask what a specific story you're comfortable sharing relating to the hardships of that job?
Let me think. I would say anytime that there was a restraint that I had to be involved in,
And how often
we
would that be?
honestly not super often because of my coworker. Um, I tried to not be involved because the other really hard thing about working in this environment, again, traumatized kids, hurt people. A lot of them were really sick, and especially working in the girls' house, I wasn't in as much danger as like my male coworkers, but they would be pretty quick to say so and so touched me, or so and so did this, and make accusations, and they had to be taken seriously even if we knew they weren't true.
Right.
So I mean, it is traumatizing. It's traumatizing to have to physically restrain anyone. Um, and then there is also a part that just, again, these girls, many of them have come in sexually abused. So the way they respond to anyone pinning them down or doing anything just was a whole other aspect of it that was really hard to watch. So that was one of the most challenging things. And then my, I don't know what you want to call him. It's weird to say boyfriend, but I mean, we were dating, we were together at the time. Um, it just was, again, very stupid of me to date someone at work, especially in that environment, um, because I couldn't escape. Like, as things went on, he wasn't a very healthy person. He had been at this job, he had been very hardened by this type of work, and had some insecurity issues. So anytime we were fighting, or in the beginning, I still was having the mindset of like, what am I doing? This guy's way older than me. He's technically a boss of mine. Like, this, I can't do this. And I would try to end the relationship. So then he would like call off work and leave me in a position where he would do that to basically like teach me a lesson, or to scare me, because if he's not coming in, I'm by myself until they can try to find someone else, because you really aren't ever supposed to be by yourself if there's more than like two kids there. So they would eventually find someone to work with me, but it the kids are going to see this is basically like a substitute teacher. Like it changed the whole dynamic of the day, and it made things 20 times more stressful for me. So he kind of used tactics like that to take advantage of me, and just remind me that like he was a very big influence on whether or not I had a good day or not.
So he was doing this like weird control thing, and like even in a
Yeah.
way threatening you. It was a threat. I mean, that was a dangerous environment. Not to mention you were 22. Considering like how much older he was, he should have, first and foremost, he should have had the restraint not to date you. And then on top of that, he was putting a younger girl in danger. And to me, like that's beyond not cool. That is
Yeah.
that makes my blood boil a little bit. And
Yeah.
yeah. Did you live with him?
Not officially, but basically he was divorced, and had two kids. So anytime, they had split custody. So
Mm-hmm.
anytime his kids were with his ex, I was with him, which was another thing that was hard. It's very common with any type of abusive relationship on any scale is very, very isolating. And that's how I felt. I didn't have, my family was back here in Ohio. My friends were in Pittsburgh or kind of scattered all over Ohio and PA, but none of them were like right in town, except for one actually, but I didn't see her a lot. And he just he didn't like being alone. So literally anytime his kids were not with him, I was expected to be there. And anytime I basically had to rearrange my life so that it was on the schedule he had with his ex. So if I wanted to go see a friend or something or go home, I had to do it on a weekend that he had his kids. And there were things that were going on not on those weekends, but then that would become a fight. And, then I would have 7,000 all caps text messages on my phone, accusing me of things or threatening me with things. I'm calling off Monday, or he wanted to scare me. Like he wanted to affect my day in some capacity. And he did. I lost a lot of weight throughout that time period. This was about 2.5 years from start to finish when I worked there. But yeah, I lost a lot of weight, and I just like let him. It just was easier to basically let him call the shots. I wanted to go to grad school, which I did, but he talked me into postponing a year because he didn't want me to leave where we were working, or he didn't want me to move back home because I said I wanted to move back home to go to grad school to save money. I didn't want to, I didn't want to stay in Pennsylvania because I knew I would stay with him. Like I knew I had to physically distance myself from him in order to completely let go of him. So he talked me into staying longer. There was like some controlling things with money. It just was all messy and not good and not healthy at all.
Hmm. It sounds like there was a lot of fear on your end involved.
Mm-hmm.
And was that part of the reason why you just had a hard time leaving this guy?
Yeah, I was afraid. I don't even know. There was definitely, it was all fear. And again, it's funny because whenever I think back on this time now, I'm just like, why didn't I just leave? Like, what was wrong with me? Like, it would be so easy to leave now, but I know, like, in the moment, your brain is thinking of all the what ifs. Nobody at work knew for obvious reasons. So I was terrified that he would, I guess I just didn't know what he would do, like what he was capable of if I said, look, I'm out of here. I'm done.
Right. And I mean, being 22, 23, however old you were at this time, I mean, I remember being that age and like I was a very different person. Very unconfident. It's just you're a different person, you're still developing in a way.
Yeah.
And that's probably what you were experiencing as well, some of that.
Right. And by this point, I had so much shame. Like I knew I had self-awareness the whole time. Like this is a disaster. Like clearly this is never going to go anywhere. Aside from the whole age thing, it had been very obvious he's not a healthy person. But I had so much shame doing what I was doing because nobody knew, not one person in my life had any idea that this relationship exists. They knew the person exists, like my mom knew about him as like my boss and things like that. And it's funny because whenever, down the road, whenever she did find out, mom intuition, she was like, I just felt like she said she couldn't explain why, but she felt very strongly that I needed to be home. Like she could tell things weren't healthy, even though she didn't know the details.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I had so much shame. And again, that's why, Satan wants you to keep everything to yourself in the dark because you can convince yourself and he can convince you that your reputation is going to be slandered and no one's going to look at you the same. Everyone's going to be embarrassed by you. Like just all these things that none of them happen. Every single person I told when I finally, had moved home and was still very mentally unwell because of it. And I had to start telling people and I had to go to counseling. Every single person that I told had so much grace for me that it just like brought me to tears every single time because they were sad for me. Like they were sad that I had spent that time so miserable. And then they were angry at, just like what you said, him being 22, 23 years older than me. He should have had the decency to not, what's the word? When you're like trying to go after someone romantically, pursue. He
Seduce.
should have been the one that, yeah, that too. Not that I was, completely innocent. I was making my own choices, but regardless, I had convinced myself that everyone would hate me and be so disappointed in me, especially like my mom and my brother. And, I've been raised as a Christian, and here I am dating, sleeping with, living with this guy who's totally inappropriate on so many levels. And shame is so, so powerful, that you let it fester long enough, it'll convince you of anything.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about that actually, the shame aspect of things, because I can relate to some of that stuff that you're talking about with the shame. Because when I was struggling with my same-sex attraction, I held that all in. And it was getting worse because I was holding it in and I was so embarrassed and so shame-filled. And so then finally when I just broke down. Like I was done with it. I broke down and I told my husband about it. And my husband was just like, Jenn, like, first and foremost, I already knew. And he's like, and secondly, I love you. And like, we're going to work through it. For years, I believed that if I told my husband about this, he was going to divorce me.
Yeah. That's probably one of the most common things I tell my clients if they're struggling with anything that they feel shame about, and they are keeping everything in the dark. I basically tell them what you just said. Even if they aren't Christians, like things always feel much more powerful than they are when you're in it alone. And you just have to trust the people in your life that, their love is not conditional. We all mess up, and sometimes mess ups just feel bigger than the average mess up. That's what I remember thinking about too. Obviously, I had sinned my whole life, but I was convinced that this sin was so big and so unforgivable that I just had to suffer in silence. And as soon as I told, my mom and my brother were the first people, it took some time to work through it, but I instantly felt better just saying things out loud and hearing them reassure me that they love me and were there for me. And then my mom helped me get set up with counseling, and then I just kind of started to progress from there. But yeah, it just diffuses everything when you stop living in something by yourself.
Exactly. So, were you still with him after? Did you quit the job at the same time as leaving, or did you quit the job and stay with him and then leave?
This was in 2016. So I basically applied to grad school like secretly from him, because we had found, well, my mom had found a program close to where they were living. So she was like, this is literally perfect. Like, got all the information for me. So I applied and just didn't tell him until like, I don't know, probably July. I waited like very last minute. And I think he knew because he had kept trying to like plan things for the future, and I was just giving him very like vague answers. So I think I told him in July that I was going to be starting school in August. And he did give me like guilt trips and stuff about it, but it was because that was the other thing I was convinced of. Like, I was so scared to put my 2 weeks in or tell him I was leaving because I thought he just would like call off my last 2 weeks, or that's when he would tell everyone we've been in the secret relationship or whatever, when I needed like their references and everything. But he, I prayed about it. That's when I like started trying to pray again and saving any relationship I had with God. And he didn't do any of that. Like, it wasn't great, but it definitely wasn't to the extreme I was afraid it was going to be. So, and I didn't, we were still like together. So in August, I finished up like, I think I gave myself maybe a week between like moving home and starting school. And him and I were still together. And I was surprised by my reaction. It's a little bit of, what's it called? Stockholm syndrome, where even though you've been in this terrible situation, it's like you fall in love with the person keeping you captive or whatever. I was so emotional moving home. And then really until I started my job, because I just kind of was going to school, I wasn't working until about October of that year. So anytime I wasn't in class, like if I had a span of a few days, I would drive back to spend days with him, because he wanted me to. But I also was like, well, now I don't know how to live with. I mean, he's been like the main person I have been associating with for 2.5 years. So I kind of had a little bit of like culture shock. And then once I started working, that was kind of like the beginning of the end, because I wasn't able to go and see him all the time. And I was getting to a place where I was like, yeah, this can't continue. So I just kind of kept being vague about things. And then the last time I probably went to go see him was maybe like around Thanksgiving. And then I told myself, like, as my New Year's resolution going into 2017, like, this is done. I don't want any part of this anymore. And I stayed true to that. And he was angry, but I think he also wasn't like shocked. So there was a small chunk of time where he was, threatening to go to my work and still blowing up my phone and trying to convince me to. It was like Jekyll and Hyde. Like, he would say how much he loved me and wanted me to come, but then also go like switch to threatening me really quick.
Well, and that's definitely a attribute of somebody who is controlling and manipulative.
Right. Right. So that period actually, so now this is like beginning of 2017. By this point, nobody knew about this relationship, but there was one night when I finally texted him and was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm not coming to see you. Like, I'm done, essentially. And he was blowing up my phone. So that is how I came to start. I confessed what was going on to my mom because she came into my room and I just was like sobbing on the floor, hyperventilating. And she was like, Rachel, what is going on with you? So So I told her, and I think she was actually relieved. Like, I think, like I said, moms know, parents know, even if they don't know what's going on. She knew I wasn't happy, healthy myself. So I told her. I ended up calling my brother like later that week, and then we found a counselor. And then I slowly, I told a few of my close friends that I could trust. And by the end of the year, I just felt so much better than the beginning. So,
Mhm.
yeah, 2017 is where things started to move along.
Right. So, what is going on in your life now? Can you share like your story of meeting your husband currently, and how did your husband respond to this story? I'd like to hear about that as well.
Um, okay, so I met my husband. Ironically, after what I just told you, I met him at work. So there's a little bit of a period where I was like, is something wrong with me? But my husband is age appropriate and was not like, we were like peers, not in any type of leadership role. So we met at work several years later. And now neither of us work at that place. But he, when I told him about this whole scenario, I think it's weird because I met him in 2019, and then everything kind of happened 20 up to 2016. But by that point, when I had met him, I was just so much healthier and stronger in my faith. Like, that's when I started, I had already been involved at our church. I had been on the worship team for a bit by that point. Like, it was the first time in my life I really felt connected to people at my church. I felt connected to God. I was healthier. Um, so I told him about it, but it's so funny how, I know it affected me. I know that was something that really, altered some things for me, but it also seems so much less big as time goes on. Like I was saying earlier, I look back at that time and I would have no issue now. I wouldn't even be in that situation. I like to think, but I would have no issue being like, I don't want to live this way. What am I doing? Like, I'm cutting it way shorter. So when I told him, um, he had concern, and had some anger of like, how could someone do that to you? Especially, someone that was much older and should have known better and shouldn't have taken advantage of you and all that, and just kind of checked in and asked like where I was with it now. Is it something that I felt was still affecting me? And honestly, it's not something I rarely think about it anymore. And by the time I met him, like I said, it had already grown much smaller to me by that point. Um, I would say the only way it still currently affects me, other than I now have a deeper understanding for what it's like to be in any type of abusive relationship and all of that. Um, I have a little bit of a trigger with older men, 50s, 60s, even though he wasn't that old, but I have a little bit of a trigger when older men are, in my opinion, overly friendly to me or to younger women. Like, I guess I have a more of a distrust for men several decades older than me now. I have more of a distrust for motives. Not to the point where it's, I'm like avoiding them and everything, but I would say that's kind of the residual effect that it's had on me.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, my husband was supportive. He just asked questions, checked in, and um, just kind of wanted to know what I needed from him to continue healing and moving forward. And yeah.
Mm. Yeah, that's awesome. And now you have your baby. But How, through all of this, what's the one way you think you can see God working in your story? Or how did you see God working at that time? I know that you said you didn't have a very strong relationship with God at some point. But how, even through that, how can you see Him working?
As I look back, it's easy for me to see now that I was never abandoned by him, even though it feels like that in the moments. Um, none of us like want to go through any type of hard challenge, right? Like life would be great if it just was up, up and up instead of up and down. But you really do grow the most in those situations. Like when my dad passed, and then what the situation I just described are two of, the hardest things I've ever gone through. And then even just with, going through trying to have a baby and that whole journey, like every aspect of my life that has been difficult, or like I said, created that before and after way of thinking is when the most work I think has been done after it. Like, especially with what I do now for a living, like I want to say I love working with, I don't want anyone to go through grief, but I'm able to kind of take what I have been through and channel it to help other people, I think, more easily, because I think you don't have to go through the exact same thing in order to help someone. But I think in some circumstances, when you have gone through it, like when you've gone through losing a parent, or when you've been in an abusive relationship, or you are navigating anything complicated and like trying to start a family aspect, I feel like it really does help other people feel heard and validated when you have gone through some version of that, even though it's not the same thing. So I think God has used all of that to help bless other people when I can, in my counseling career. And I feel like it's just the classic, like sometimes you have to hit rock bottom in order to really build yourself back up. Like if I hadn't gone through what I had gone through in that relationship, I don't know. I needed to move back home. I needed to get rooted in a church, and I needed to basically like surrender everything because I just was so unhealthy. And, like I said, when I went to counseling, yes, we talked a lot about the relationship, especially in the beginning, but by the end, it ended up being about my dad because there was stuff that was unresolved there. So, God knew I wasn't done navigating that yet, and just kind of waited until I was ready, apparently, to get out of it and start doing the work to heal. So he's used every challenging and hard thing that's happened to me to grow my relationship deeper with him.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And so, the last thing I want to ask is what advice would you like to tell the audience relating to your story?
The number one thing I think, which we kind of touched on earlier, is don't listen to Satan when he tries to convince you to keep things in the dark, bringing things to the light, even though it's so scary because it's fear of the unknown, of people's responses. But if you trust the people in your life, it's going to be so much better to bring them in it with you, because
Mm-hmm.
we just need people, which is the second piece of advice. Lean on the people in your life. Like we God didn't design us to get through these things by ourselves. Everyone says it takes a village to raise a child, but I really feel like it takes a village to get through grief. It takes a village to get through an abusive relationship, or any other aspect of trauma that you can go through in a lifetime. We're not supposed to go through it by ourselves. So don't be afraid to ask for help when there are signs that you're not doing very well. Um, and know that it doesn't make you any less of a person, and it's going to benefit you. It's going to make you healthier. And it's not going to leave you being defined by your trauma, which is where a lot of people get stuck when they don't ask for help and when they don't actually try to move forward from it. Aside from just my job and getting, at this point, I've seen pretty much any circumstance that you can think of terrible things that have happened to people. Lots of grief for sure, lots of abusive relationships. So I have seen the relief in people's faces when they don't feel, especially in the abusive relationships part. I think there's a lot of stigma surrounding that, and why people are scared to talk about it is because if you haven't been in one, it's pretty easy to say, just leave. Like, what are you doing? Why is this woman staying with this guy when he treats her like garbage, blah, blah, blah. And you learn that things are not black and white. There's a lot of gray area, and it's not always that simple. So I've seen a lot of validation for people when I acknowledge that, like that I'm not expecting them to have one session with me and then go, break up with their boyfriend or whoever the next day. I think a lot of people need to just hear that they're not judged for it. And then people in my personal life too. I've had several friends since my dad has passed that have lost parents, and not that that makes it easier for them, but I think grief, this is just my personal opinion, but I think grief is a niche area where it really does help to talk to someone that has been through it. Even though no one's experience is the same, even if I lost my dad and you lost your dad, it's still different relationships. We're different people and all that. But people can say unintentionally, but nonetheless say kind of silly things to people that are grieving, things that they think they want to hear. And that's not usually the case. So I just think it's so important to talk to people in those time periods that get it. So I feel like God has used me as that person for several situations for sure.
That's awesome. And that's great advice also. So where could somebody who is struggling with something find someone to talk to? Is there any resource you can give on that?
I obviously am an advocate for counseling. So I would say that's the first aspect. And obviously it varies depending on where people are living, but there's usually always some type of, again, depending on the severity of it, there's usually always a county crisis line. Several resources that have sliding fee scales. If you need services but aren't sure how you're going to make it work with insurance or whatever. Faith-based stuff can be a little trickier. But a lot of counties also have some version of 211 where you call 211 and you say, hey, I'm looking for a food bank, or I'm looking for a counseling for my kid, a mental health counselor, or I'm looking for an addiction group or something. And they will provide you with the resources that they know of and at least gets you started. So I would say that is a good start. And I would also say, if you're part of a church, talk to your pastor. I know if anyone talks to our pastor and said, look, I need counseling, he would, give them a list of people that he knows of, or different resources that he knows. So I would encourage people to talk to the pastor of their church as well and see if they could provide any insight.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And I hope everybody enjoyed Rachel's testimony and gained something from this episode. But I will see you all next time on the YouTube channel. Until then, happy watching and God bless.